Welcome to Cognitive Science Meet the Thinking Classroom. This is a synthesis that I've prepared between David Sousa's How the Brain Learns Mathematics, specifically chapters 5 and 6 in Peter Liljedahl's Thinking Classroom. This synthesis is being presented to the EOSDN book study. That is the Eastern Ontario Staff Development Network book study. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the hard work that goes into organizing and facilitating these times of collaborative learning for each of us. Special thanks to the members of the EOSDN project group for their commitment to drawing us all together. And thank you to each of the district teams participating today and for honoring us with your time as well as your desire to learn and to learn on behalf of one another. In part, it is through these networked opportunities that we come to gradually changing the context for how we teach, lead, and learn. All of us benefit by drawing nearer to the perspectives shared here and shared beyond. I'd like you to take a moment to read the quote that's in front of you. It's a powerful quote. This was taken during an interview that I held with Jamie DePipo, who is a colleague and educator in the Ottawa Catholic School Board. In addition to this reflection, I'd like to share with you the following that was held on a recent podcast hosted by Kyle Pierce and John Orr with Dr. Peter Liljedahl. And he mentions that when students are not thinking, everything we teach is difficult, which begs the question, how do we build engaged students who are thinking, making meaning, and actively making commitments to getting better through self-assessment? So in relation to the Thinking Classroom framework, as well as cognitive science reflected through David Sousa's book, I did some reflecting with an SAO thought partner, that is a student achievement officer and thought partner. Two questions we raised. So the first one being, what does this mean for educators' planning? So such a provocation, what does that mean for our planning? So think of it in this sense, that adolescents are more likely to respond emotionally than rationally. And that it may be difficult for them to override those automatic responses because their prefrontal cortex is still maturing. So how can we better support their learning? A second question that was raised was the notion of novelty. So how does novelty, certainly in the context of the Thinking Classroom, fit into the larger conversations that we're having now about student engagement? So ultimately, the goal for sharing this with you today is that we can create a space where we can linger to determining how this synthesis in our study of Sousa's book, or brain-based learning, cognitive science, can impact your professional practice. So a quick summary of chapter 5. So here are a few highlights that were taken. You may get a sense that through the course of development that we're looking to support as educators students' executive functioning. Of course, that carries on throughout much of our lives. Chapter 6 was with regards to the adolescent brain. So at this stage, we see that adolescents are growing in their ability to handle visual motor tasks, and their ability to problem solve increases. Much of that, of course, related to consolidation of those neural networks or pruning in the frontal lobes. We see that working memory also continues to develop. So the average number of items we can hold in our working memory increases. And thirdly, our ability to encode information to memory increases. And you can see that this particular list that I've provided here also gives suggestions as to how we might teach and assess in order to help students encode to memory. So that is making sure there's enough time to process and reprocess. Of course, that involves particular learning experiences, for example, effective questioning, as well as supporting cognitive closure. So after a period of learning, or after one has gone through an experience, what opportunities do we provide that helps students to consolidate and bring closure to their learning? So we can get a sense of certain themes here. So with the pre-adolescent brain, there was a theme around supporting executive functioning. That doesn't go away, of course, with the adolescent brain, but we do see maturation in the sense that they are better able to handle visual motor tasks, are more creative in terms of problem solving, and their memory also improves in terms of its working abilities as well as its long-term storage. So that's David Sousa's chapters 5 and 6. Now, when we think about the thinking classroom, if you're new to it, there are 14 elements. Each of the elements are partitioned into what are called gears. And the gears, when we're new to thinking classrooms, or perhaps new to our professional and pedagogical practice, is they are taken in nearly a linear order. So gear 1, we start with good tasks, visibly random groups, and vertical non-permanent surfaces. Gear 2, there are 5 elements ranging from using verbal instructions, having no front to the room, answering thinking questions that allow students to keep thinking as opposed to stop thinking. Element 7, students building meaningful notes, and then element 8 is building autonomy. You can see that I've added in my own wondering, so I'm use the word student, so I'm always wondering and curious as to how students are interacting with each of these particular elements. In Gear 2, my curiosity lies around elements 6, 7, as well as 8. In Gear 3, there are 3 elements, using hints and extensions to manage flow. Number 10 is about lesson consolidation, and number 11 is assigning check your understanding questions. So you can see again, I'm posing some wonderings about how students are contributing to the conversation, as well as how they're growing in terms of their self-assessment. So you can see that gears 2 and 3, there are a number of criteria or elements there that are geared towards formative assessment. Gear 4, the final gear, and the final 3 elements, so we have a communication on part of the teacher to where students are going. Again, I've put a student component in there as well. And the last 2, I would say they are more aligned to an assessment of learning. So element 13, it's important that teachers decide what is important to evaluate. So evaluate what you value. As well as number 14 is reporting out, and not based on a collection or counting of points, but rather looking at data in a disaggregated manner. If you'd like to read more about my writing on these particular elements, please see my professional blog, which is embedded here in the slideshow, as well as on the website. So, moving on. I mentioned that this was really a synthesis. So 2 questions being raised. What aspects of the thinking classroom are responsive to cognitive development? So that is, how do we use the thinking classroom to support student cognition? And then in a reciprocal manner, how does student cognitive processes, how does the brain shape how we enact thinking classroom enabled pedagogy? So how does cognitive science inform our moves as educators? So qualitatively, when it came to coding, I thought deeply upon my own practice, what I currently understand about thinking classroom-enabled pedagogy, which is also informed by the evidence-informed practices of other educators, and how I would see myself in relation to both cognitive science or brain science and thinking classrooms if I were in a role examining both. So just to give you an idea of how I coded, so I took the elements from the thinking classroom and based on evidence and my own experiences, and then sort of bumped them up against each of those particular themes, if you will, that I came up with from chapters 5 and 6 for both pre-adolescent and adolescent stages. So what did I find out? And again, before we go to that, if you'd like to learn more, please see my writing on my blog at Flipping the Focus. Well, here are a few summary graphics. So the first one is for the pre-adolescent stage, and this shows the prevalence of the gears. So not each of the elements independently, but rather as a collection. So in the pre-adolescent stage, you can see a prevalence of gear 2 in comparison to the rest. In the adolescent stage, a slight change or reversal is that gear 3 shows slightly more prevalence than gear 2. Now, if we dissect each of the gears and represent the frequency of those elements independently, yet combined into the same graphic, you can see that the blue graph is that of the pre-adolescent frequency of elements, as well as the red, which is the adolescent frequency of elements. So that particular portion of the pre-adolescent graph, if you will, you can see that there are a number of elements that are in that particular range of occurrence. Whereas in the adolescent stage, you can see a bit of a spike. It is somewhat commensurate with that area, with that particular focus on gears 2 and 3. So just a reminder regarding the adolescent stage, as well as that particular increase in terms of how the elements from gear 3 were coded to the adolescent markers. Again, these are all related to how educators manage flow within a thinking classroom, how we consolidate, and the assignment of checking your understanding questions. So based on that synthesis, leads us to asking the following: what does it mean? What are some possible implications? So let's start by addressing some meaning and implications. So particularly meanings. So let's think about gear 2. Gear 2 elements seem to be more widely represented in setting the foundation for complex interactions between pre-adolescent learners with elements of the assessment loop. So again, that's a conjecture. Now, with respect to gear 3, we can conjecture again. So there seems to be a prevalence of gear 3 in the adolescent stage. So perhaps it's as we leverage students' growing capacity to solving complex problems for deepening their conceptual understanding that we see that prevalence occurring. We might also see how assigning fewer meaningful check your understanding problems could put less strain on working memory, provide adequate time for elaborate rehearsal. So both of these really lending themselves to developing procedural fluency. So again, those are some conjectures presented based on the synthesis. Now you might be wondering why there would be an underrepresentation of gears 1 and 4. Now gears 1 and 4, even gears 2, so as E4 and E5, those particular elements relate specifically to how we arrange the physical environment and how we work with or structure group processes. Whereas in gear 4, specifically elements 13 and 14, those are the assessment of elements. Formative assessment is the space where we tend to spend and should spend most of our time. So it's natural not to see those two elements. And of course, I'd like to conjecture that it's not likely to see the prevalence of Gear 1 and the first two elements in Gear 2 within the coding, because those, again, I mentioned, are things that may not be tangible or noticeable, things that can be coded against those markers that I mentioned from David Sousa's book. But what I do want to say about those is that from a pedagogical perspective and practically, these components are necessary. And in fact, Dr. Liljedahl would say that those first three, those factors are untenable. So based on empirical research, those three things, if they're not in place from the beginning and held onto by both teacher and students consistently, the thinking classroom cannot work. Now, possible implications, definitely there's some importance here to examining the value of our pedagogical practice on student engagement and learning. Ultimately, that's why we do what we do. That's why this synthesis has been prepared. Also, an implication of representation of research. So this might suggest or might implicate a representation of action-based research or necessity of action-based research and collaborative inquiries that we can be doing alongside and in support of learning for all. So with regards to research opportunities, so I'd like to propose hypothetically that we would need, especially with this synthesis, much more inter-rater reliability on the synthesis itself, as well as some background review of books and research that are related to both cognitive science and the thinking classroom, as well as pedagogical practices, those that have been shown to impact cognitive development. Also, as an implication, it's important to know and remember that we can attend to planning and interacting with learners in ways, so that's specific ways that will bring about growth through these stages of cognitive development. So this takes us back to the beginning. So 2 wonderings. I've given you certainly lots, I hope, to think about, to wonder, to question, to seek out, to build on. So what does that mean for you? What does it mean for us? What does it mean for education in terms of planning to improving student engagement? And also novelty. Novelty is an important feature in terms of transferring knowledge or transferring one's experience from one side of the brain to the other, in terms of encoding information and moving on, seeking out more. So how does novelty in the context of this type of classroom, this pedagogy, fit into conversations, perhaps those larger ones that go beyond our classroom, that go beyond our schools, across districts? As far as hypotheses are concerned, we could probably think of the following. The thinking classroom can be enacted in such ways that support the development of student cognition, as well as the thinking classroom supporting what is currently known about cognitive science and brain maturation. So these 2 hypotheses could certainly be studied. I'd like to propose that if both A and B, those 2 hypotheses, can be shown to be true, we'll know that the following will be corollary. When students understand how they learn and why a particular pedagogy is being used, they will be more likely to see themselves as confident and assessment-capable learners. So I'd like to thank you so much for your time in listening to this screencast on a synthesis between cognitive science as well as the thinking classroom. In terms of my own current research interests, reculturing assessment through pedagogy, specifically thinking classrooms, is of great interest to me, and in terms of its impact and links to equity, as well as student social emotional learning. I believe that this can be well informed through collaboration with classroom educators and educators in various roles and across districts. So for example, if you're working in a PLC, If you're involved in a network, so an educator-based network, be it teachers, administrators, coaches, or all together. And of course, a keen interest in supporting educators in the field, so being close to the work and the work that does provide us with new insight to how we can reculture assessment through thinking classrooms. Again, if you've got interest in this, absolutely, I would encourage you to go to my blog at Flipping the Focus, check out some of the posts that are there related to this topic as well as others. And I'd also encourage you that if you are looking for someone to be a thought partner, to collaborate in terms of these particular areas of research and of interest, then please reach out to me at christopher.stewart2@ontario.ca. Thank you.